Welcome to worship this morning. It's good to be with you all again. So, as a reminder, I'm Cherise Bach, and I'm coming to you from my meeting house at North Valley Friends out in Oregon. And I got some requests to introduce the elders that have been journeying with me so that you can see their faces and know who is sitting on our virtual facing bench today. So I'll introduce them and have them say hello and say what meeting they're from. So Mary Hopkins.
Good morning, friends. I'm from Fresh Pond Meeting, Salem Quarter.
And Jean Rosenberg.
Middlebury Meeting in Vermont.
Thank you, Jean. And Jean is going to be our elder for the day, closing this meeting. And then Dove John from Sierra Cascades yearly meeting. I asked her to accompany me, and she's also a representative from Sierra Cascades with me. And since she doesn't get to just hang around and chat with everybody in between, so I'll also have her say a little bit about what she's interested in and what she might want to connect with friends about.
Hi, I'm Dove John, and thank you, Cherise. I'm with the FCNL, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, annual meeting planning committee, and I'm also on a subcommittee for equity and inclusion. I'd like to invite all Quakers, but especially Quakers of color, because our equity and inclusion plan involves Quakers of color meeting together and going to our representatives and talking about what is of concern to us. So please connect with me later if you have a chance to about coming to FCNL annual meeting.
Thank you, Dove, and thank you to all three of you wonderful elders for your great support and for holding this meeting in the light as we meet together. So today is going to be a little bit more theoretical than the other days of this week of my sharing with you. So sorry, not sorry, that's what you get when you ask a professor to come share with you. The other days, I'll try to give a little bit more story, but this one I feel like we need to kind of ground in a bit of theory. So bear with me on that. I'm hoping that you'll see this as a way to help us imagine a metaphor that is both familiar and new, and that can orient us and open us up to the transformative ways that we need to relate to others, creation, and God in this moment. And so I'm going to be using the Quaker metaphor of the inward light and the text of John 1 to help us reimagine what theology of the inward light can look like in our kind of transformative, reimagined ways that we're practicing thinking and acting in the world in this time. And I appreciated going to your business meeting this morning and hearing the work that you're doing. It's really encouraging and inspiring. So thank you for that good work that you're doing. And I really appreciate the work of the, now I'm forgetting the name, the Noticing Patterns of Oppression and Faithfulness Working Group. Thank you so much for pointing out the ways that we are still working on our practices of learning how to get better about not centering whiteness. And so I feel like as a white woman, I am hopeful that what I'm offering is an example of how to move forward with sharing our stories and our light that we have in ways that that bring about that dispersal of wisdom and knowledge, awareness of the light coming in from all different places. So hopefully that is the case, and please let me know if I step out of that bound. Yesterday, we talked about the need for an Eco Reformation where our understanding of ourselves and the human role moves from an individual eco-hierarchical perspective or ego-hierarchical perspective to an eco perspective. So if the tech team could bring up that slide, we can get that visual again. So we see ourselves as participants in the ongoing co-creation of the community of all life within that eco perspective. And I use the story from Mark 8 of the man who is partially healed of his blindness with Jesus' first healing touch, suggesting the first Reformation may have gotten us part of the way in seeing Jesus clearly, but we need to be open to a second touch as friends. That second touch opens us, particularly those of us who are of European heritage, to a new clarity regarding ways the Western Empire and the myth of white supremacy have infiltrated our theology and our Quaker systems, and that these attitudes have caused a situation of profound danger in terms of how we utilize the resources of creation, as well as the ways that we oppress people and other species. I asked us why each of us is a Quaker and whether or not Quakerism needs to continue. Can we go through the necessary work of this Eco Reformation as a community? I hope that we can, and I agree with Dr. Amanda Kemp that we need to let ourselves imagine big as we envision the shift we're in the middle of going through. In that vein, I'll speak today about a way friends can engage with this work based on the text of John 1 and the Quaker understanding of the inward light. My hope is to give us a particularly Quaker entry point into the shift toward an ecological worldview that's required in an eco-reformation. So I'll read the prologue of John 1, and that text is going to be available in the chat. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The Word was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through the Word, and without the Word, not one thing came into being. What has come into being in the Word was life, and the life was the light of all people. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. I'll hazard a guess that this is a favorite passage of many friends, perhaps a close second to John 15, where our denominational name comes from. In this passage, the Word and the light come into the world, becoming flesh in Jesus. The eternal presence that was with God and was God chooses to enter creation in a unique way. While this passage is beloved by many friends, it's also the source of some of our most enduring controversies about the nature of Jesus. And while these are interesting questions, I'm not going to get into them today. I hope that no matter what your perspective is on Jesus' identity, that you can open yourself up to that perspective being challenged and expanded. So what's important about this passage as we're developing an ecological worldview, and particularly a Quaker one? I'm going to first unpack this passage by reading it through an ecological and decolonizing lens. And then I'll talk about how this shifts and expands our Quaker understanding of the inward light. In this passage, Jesus is described as the divine Logos, the Word, as well as the life-bringing light. In the context of that time period, the author of John was both connecting the Jesus movement to the Greek philosophical tradition and challenging that tradition. He was also drawing together Hebrew and Greek cosmologies, or understandings of the universe. In Greek philosophical tradition, the Logos, or Word, was considered the ultimate essence of reason, order, and logic. Some Greek philosophers equated the Logos with God. The Logos is that which gives meaning to the cosmos, the original word that symbolizes all thought and communication. Light was closely associated with the Logos, as in the Enlightenment. Light was seen as a metaphor for that which opens up our understanding. It's the source of life, so its essential quality is source. This understanding of the concepts of Logos and light were influenced by Plato and developed through other Platonists. The basic idea was that there were essential forms that exist as abstract concepts, but cannot exist in their absolute sense in the material world. For example, imagine a sphere. You can imagine a perfect sphere that's completely smooth with a diameter that's consistent no matter where you slice it along its central point. In real life, however, there's no way to create such a form. So I'll remind friends about the pattern of perfection that has been pointed out, that this ideal, this Greek concept of the ideal, is sort of where that pattern of perfection comes from. And so this is part of what we're learning to break down. So this led to dualism, which you can see on this slide. The concept or abstraction is the ideal, whereas the material world can only be an imperfect grasping toward that ideal. In much of Greek thought and religious expression, therefore, the material world was seen as less than, while the world of the Logos, the spiritual and rational realm, was considered disconnected from the material world and was an ideal to reach for. In the several centuries after Jesus, this hierarchical dualism between matter and spirit developed into Gnosticism and Neoplatonism, and we can see the beginnings of this controversy being addressed throughout the Bible. There's a struggle to define the evil parts of the world and the benefits of a spiritual perspective, while also a strong emphasis on the goodness of creation and our embodied existence. So hold that thought. The word, or logos, invoked in John 1, helps connect the Jesus movement to Greek philosophy, which was important as Jesus' followers are spreading his message around the Greek-speaking world. But the Platonic ideals can lead to a dualism of matter and spirit that is not consistent with the message of Jesus. As we read along in the text of John 1, the word was pre-existent, and through it, the work of creation was conceived and birthed. The word is also the light, the bringer of life. The light overpowers darkness. John the Baptist was a prophet that could speak of the light, but was not himself the light. So far, the passage is consistent with Greek ideals. But then something strange and potentially heretical to Greek thought happens. The text moves from talking about the light as an it, the word for light in Greek is neuter, without gender, to talking about he. In verse 9, it says, the light, the true one, the one who gives light to all people, was coming into the world, and it switches to masculine pronouns. The reader would have been wondering who this he is. Then things get really challenging from the Greek worldview. This pre-existent logos and true light becomes flesh and is born and pitches his tent among us in verse 14. The word translated dwell or skenao literally means pitches a tent or to dwell in a tent. And the Greek words that I'm talking about are available in the chat, so you can kind of follow along and refer back to them if you forget what one of them means. So this eternal ideal comes camping with us, pitching a tent, incarnating a human form, and hangs out with us for a while in the midst of creation. This challenges the Greek notion of the material world being evil or a place to be avoided. In many of the other religious traditions swirling around in that time period, an eternal, essential God could not actually come in contact with matter because matter was evil. It was necessary to try and escape and negate one's material desires and needs as much as possible in order to seek the spiritual. John's gospel starts right off the top challenging this dualism. The material world is not evil. God can incarnate in a body, one which communicates the true light powerfully to the world. When we read this passage using an ecological and decolonizing lens, a few things stand out. The first and most important is the part about the incarnation. Our word for incarnation comes from the Latin meaning in the flesh. I know enough about Spanish to know that our Spanish speakers have an even clearer sense of what this term means, encarne, in the meat. The eternal ideal of logic and spiritual truth became a participant in creation, fully fleshed, birthed by a woman in all the messiness that surrounds childbirth, and which was often considered unclean. I'll also point out here in a feminist reading of the text that it says, not out of the desire or will of any man, and it doesn't use the gender inclusive word anthropos. It uses the word for a man, andros. This wasn't a plan dreamed up or able to be controlled by any man. Instead, it was a generative work of co-creation. So Jesus, according to the text, comes in the flesh, camping with us for a time, and he's the embodiment of the ideal. And in so doing, he completely breaks open the Greek understanding of that ideal. In the Greek ideal, matter and logos could not meet, and the goal was to escape material reality, to live mostly on the plane of ideas and spiritual attunement. So here's where the slide comes in. This is an idea that has also greatly influenced the entire Western cultural, philosophical, and religious tradition, setting up a dualistic hierarchy wherein males are considered more rational and therefore closer to the ideal than women. Westerners, read whites, are considered more civilized and therefore closer to the ideal than people from other cultures. Christians are closer to the ideal than non-Christians, and human beings are closer to the ideal than other parts of creation, setting up a social hierarchy with implications in politics, economics, legal systems, and the way we think about and distribute land and natural resources. This is the basis for the egoic worldview we discussed yesterday, and for the doctrine of discovery, which I know your yearly meeting has discussed in other settings. By showing the eternal word and light becoming flesh, John 1 completely destroys this hierarchical dualism and shows a God who is relational and participatory. Also, in addition to opening up the Greek worldview, this challenged the assumptions of the Jewish religious leadership of Jesus's day in relation to their understanding of the Messiah. As we discussed yesterday, Mark's Jesus shows the disciples that they are only seeing his true nature in part. They had idealized the Messiah as someone who would come and take over the throne of David and establish an empire through military might. In this passage in John 1, the author is setting up his response to that assumption, showing Jesus as Messiah and as so much more than just a military leader who will establish a new nation of Israel. Instead, he's a pre-existent part of God, and he came to his own, but his own did not recognize him. Obviously, Jesus himself was a Jew, and many Jews did recognize him as a Messiah, and many Jews now do recognize the light that we all experience. So this is not to say that his own people didn't recognize him in that way, but that those who held the power of interpreting the scriptures in his community did not recognize him because they were expecting an empire builder. So the first important thing we notice about the passage is that it both fits with and challenges Greek and Hebrew understandings. The material world can be and is infused with the ideal of the logos and the light, with the word made flesh, born, walking around and dying, completely participating in the messiness of creation. And although the Messiah is completely in the flesh and participating in everything that goes along with being human, he's not an imperial ruler who will play into the egoic hierarchy of domination and control by restoring Israel's earthly monarchy. Rather, he camps out among us, showing us his glory to those who can sense it. But many of those with authority in religious circles do not recognize him because they themselves are participating in the worldview of domination and control. The second thing that we can notice when reading John 1 from an ecological and decolonizing perspective is the use of the word world. The word translated world in verses 9 through 10 is cosmos. He came into the cosmos and he had created the cosmos, but the cosmos did not recognize him. This can come across as implying that the world was completely unable to comprehend the logos. So perhaps the Greek understanding of the separation between spirit and matter would be able to be supported if the world is assumed to be the material world in general. While the term cosmos is sometimes used to mean something similar to our understanding of the cosmos, as in the whole universe or the interstellar expanses, it often has the connotation in the Bible of referring to worldly affairs and implies a system of order. When Jesus says in John 18:36 that his kingdom is not of this world, he uses this term to mean that his kingdom is not related to the ways that the worldly authorities set up their affairs. It is not a military endeavor or a political party. So here in John 1, 9 through 10, the systems that order human affairs did not recognize Jesus. Those with political and religious power, those who benefited from the empire of their day, are the cosmos, and they did not know the word or recognize the light in Jesus. There are two other important words in Greek that are not present in this passage, but that can help us get a sense of what the author is not saying about the material world here. The first is ktisis, which means creation. You'll recall that God created everything and called it good. And we'll talk about that later in the week, about this term relating to how all of creation participates in the work God is doing of reconciling all things. Creation is good, and it's a part of the story, not just a backdrop for human experience. In other words, creation is different from what the author of John is talking about here as the world. The second word I want to explain is oikumene, which means the entire world in the sense of the planet we inhabit. This term comes from the root oikos, meaning household, and oikos is also the root of our English words with the prefix eco, as in ecology and economy. You might say oikumene is the earth community, the place where life happens, and it is intensely communal, implying a household, a relational network. So the main distinction I'm drawing here is that the term cosmos has more to do with the powers and principalities of this world, the structures that are set up to order human affairs, but this is not talking about the material world in general. Creation is good and the planet is good. It's our household, the place in which we live and relate to God and show love for our neighbors. When the Word and Light became incarnate and pitched a tent among us in the person of Jesus, Jesus did so in the oikumene, and although the cosmos did not recognize him, this does not mean creation or the material world is evil. Jesus showed us an example of how to live within the oikumene while resisting the harmful aspects of the cosmos, the systems and structures of power, the ways that worldly authorities try to control and dominate. He embodied the life-giving light and word that can create and co-create, that can go camping with us and smash the patriarchy with us, that can speak the divine word into our deepest longings for meaning, and that can reconcile us to our embodied selves in all our mess of lived experience. So to summarize, when we read from an ecological and decolonizing worldview on John 1, it shows us that the eternal word and light is intimately connected and incarnated into creation. And although the systems and powers of this world do not recognize Jesus, embodiment of the divine way, he is offering us a pattern, an example of what it looks like to participate fully in the ecology, the household of creation. While this is important for anyone who's seeking to participate in the Eco Reformation, what is particularly Quaker about it, you might be asking? Well, let me tell you. An idea that's been rolling around in my head and that I'm writing about with my good friend Christy Randazzo from Philadelphia Yearly Meeting is the idea of an Eco Theology of Light, which I think will be a way for friends to expand on our tradition's beautiful and meaningful metaphor of the inward light, so that it is not only a mystical spiritual experience, but it also includes our embodied experience. So here's the deal. I think Quakers have often fallen into the dualistic problems I explained in regards to Western thought, where we think of the spiritual and rational or intellectual, the logos, as more important than the material. We can try to escape our embodied form by practicing silent internal worship. While we do have a pretty good track record of our contemplative style of worship grounding us in the courage and moral fortitude to take stands for social justice, which relates to the material world, in my experience, our understanding of the inward light is often focused on individual mystical encounter and may or may not be connected to engagement with a participatory community, be that human or beyond human. So I'm going to try out this idea on you of a Quaker eco theology of light. Here's what I'm thinking. John 1 begins with the eternal word and explains that the word is the creator and what it was creating is life. And life was the light of all people. While John the Baptist was able to testify to that light, Jesus embodied it and made it accessible to all who receive him. And this occurred through incarnation into a a body that dwelled on this planet and interacted with people and other parts of creation. This wasn't just a metaphorical light, a spiritual light that opens us up to a mystical realm where we can escape from our bodily existence. Instead, this is a light that is intimately connected to life, the living, breathing, birthing, and dying life, without which none of us can experience God, or anything else for that matter. Since we have to exist in bodies, at least for this earthly part of our journey. I'm proposing that we expand our Quaker understanding of the inward light to not only refer to our personal spiritual experience, but to also include our connectedness to all the rest of the life on planet Earth and in our solar system and the universe. So the inward light is a partial vision, but we need that second healing touch to see more fully how the light is at work. I'll explain what this expanded view of the light means theologically and how our usual understandings of the light sometimes lead us back to an egoic view of the world and what it looks like to truly see in this light metaphor into an Eco Reformation. Light from the sun literally makes it possible for there to be life on this planet. If you think of the ecosystem in which you live, most of the species rely directly on light to grow and be nourished. And the species that do not receive the direct effects of light because they're underground receive the indirect effects by working to decompose things that were once nourished by light and by creating underground networks to transfer energy from the sun from one being to another, as was mentioned in the unprogrammed time yesterday, the mycorrhizae, the fungal networks that connect all the trees. All life on this planet is supported and connected by the sun's life-giving energy moving through the ecosystem. Light is the currency and the current moving through the entire oikos, the ecosystem, and the economy. And it allows us each to participate in the whole process. We're all related to each other in our reliance on the light, as well as our different ways of processing and experiencing that light, so that we can ideally collaborate together toward a system in which each one receives the light we need, gives out of our abundance, and each has a niche and a purpose that is unique and needed by the whole. I think sometimes our Quaker understanding of the inward light can prop up a hierarchical, egoic worldview within Quakerism, where we think of each person as an individual connecting with the light, and we think of ourselves as human beings as special in our ability to access that light compared to other species. By expanding our idea of the light from one of personal experience to an ecosystem model, where the light connects us to all other life, we become participants in the co-labor of life-making. We move from a worldview of trying to dominate and control the world around us to one of partnership and collaboration, working together across the oikumene, the global household. An egoic understanding of the inward light can easily become competitive, where my understanding of the light must win by controlling or dominating, by convincing you of my authority to interpret the light, or simply by being my interpretation that's disconnected from yours, or from its real-world impacts and doesn't really apply to anyone else. This sounds to me, however, quite similar to the cosmos, the worldly authorities who did not recognize the incarnation of the divine light, who tried to control Jesus and interpret the scripture in ways that kept their place in the status quo in the religious and political systems to privilege themselves. Our appeals to the guidance of the inward light when practiced in this egoic perspective can end up in the same place. We end up reproducing the systems of white supremacy, overuse of natural resources, and competitive economic models that only benefit a few. An Eco Theology of Light reminds us of our relatedness to one another and to the rest of creation. It also emphasizes humility. We are a species that can respond to the light, but we are not the only one. An Eco Theology of Light reorients us from the cosmos and emphasis on order, expressed harmfully through requirements of uniformity, to an emphasis on diversity. In an ecosystem, all parts are needed, and each species and individual within that ecosystem contributes a piece that could not be contributed by anyone else. The cosmos model creates acres and acres of single monocrops and replicates strip malls across the country and world with the same stores. It creates factories where the machine parts as well as the human workers are interchangeable. It creates law and order where the laws perpetuate the status quo and the order is the Pax Romana, the government-sanctioned violent enforcement of resistance. The Eco Theology of Light celebrates biodiversity and creativity. It's flexible and adaptive, resilient in the face of change, and works with the planet's natural cycles of more and less light, as well as different ecosystems' successionary stages in the case of fire, storm, volcano, or other natural disturbance. Within this model, each individual relies on the others in the ecosystem to nourish one another as we process the light in our different ways. We go through seasons and cycles. We're open to birth and death. We participate in periods of growth and of decomposition. We recognize our own and our community's limits, and we live within them with gratitude and flourishing. Just as Jesus' rejection of the harmful interpretations of the religious leaders of his day did not mean he was saying anything goes, in Eco Theology of Light points us back to the life-giving laws that sustain us, that help us to live as a community. These laws look different in each context. Each individual grows differently and is formed by their geographical location. The amount of light each receives is different based on where they are on the planet and the actions of other individuals around them. Ecosystems are always changing and growing. There's no such thing as eternal stasis or equilibrium. It's living and dynamic. The natural laws create space for unique ways of flourishing to occur, for diversity to emerge in all its glory. When I titled these talks, A Quaker Ecology, Meditations on the Future of Friends, this is the Quaker ecology I have in mind. If friends are to have a faithful future, I believe it will be in this direction, moving ourselves from our tendency as a society of friends in the United States to get caught up in systems that perpetuate white supremacy and ecological degradation by centering ourselves and our individual light over that of others, and moving toward a participation in the community of all life. So tomorrow we'll be talking about the implications of participating as members in this community of all life, compared to our attempts to try to pretend we're outside that community, controlling it and claiming the light's benefits for our own species and our own people groups. This is spiritual work that requires us to show up as fully embodied persons, carrying the spark of the divine light that we can recognize at work in each one, human and other than human. So tomorrow we'll be talking about watershed discipleship with a focus on water and land. Not tomorrow, Thursday. And Friday we'll be talking about air and spirit and bringing in environmental justice, environmental racism, and the phrase, I can't breathe. And on Saturday, we'll be talking about having an embodied enactment of prophetic hope. So that's where we're going with the rest of these sessions. Let's take some time to listen together.